And welcome to Go Your Way. I'm Greg Neerman, joined again with Phoebe Go. And Phoebe, we're doing this a little bit differently. Folks that have been watching the Go Your Way podcast series might remember our bantering and engagement with industry thought leaders before. But now we've taken kind of a different approach with this series. We're going to go a little bit deeper into very specific subject areas. So we've got a whole library in what we're calling this series on data protection. And I'm really excited about this, Phoebe, because it's one of the areas that there's this weird dichotomy where I think we have a history of really respecting data protection. But as environments have evolved, as we've seen the emergence of hybrid cloud or cloud native, all of a sudden there's been some assumptions about what's protected, what's not protected, how it's managed, what the automation looks like. So the landscape, even though data protection's kind of considered a little bit old school. We all remember the LTO and DLT tapes. As environments have changed, so have the requirements for data protection.
Great monologue, Greg. I love it. I'm so glad to be back here. We have cool new music. We have some excellent guests, and we have this great background too. And you're so right. I mean, things change so rapidly these days. It's almost like backup is an afterthought for so many people going, well, let's just move faster and faster and faster, and let's build the coolest cloud things, or, let's get our offices back up and running because we've had to shut them down for various world events. And so, okay, this whole data protection element, sometimes it just seems like, gosh, where do you even begin, right? So I'm really excited about this series because we have some thought leaders from both within NetApp and outside to talk about data protection and, of course, its sibling, recovery. Who's with us for today's episode, Greg?
So we've got Troy Wilson, Deputy CTO for NetApp, here joining us. And Troy, to kind of do a level set, right up front, data protection is such a broad topic. And we think about ransomware, data protection. Phoebe mentioned recovery. There's the technology, there's the cultural elements to this and best practices. When we say data protection, it's very broad. When you think about data protection and how you're working with your customers, what kind of focus or scope, when we say data protection, what do we mean?
That's a great question. And, when you introduced everything, you hit on a lot of technologies that I think a lot of people's minds go to when you talk about data protection. And sometimes that's purely around backup. And that is definitely an aspect of data protection, but it's far broader than that. And especially when we see a lot of what's going on in the industry, think about the ransomware attacks, malicious activities, when we also get into just really the value that data is within an organization. For some organizations, that is their business. Their entire business is the data that they have access to or what they're able to do with that. So when we really look at what is data protection, it is multi-pronged. It's a bit more vast than I think a lot of people traditionally thought about it. But it was ensuring that the data in an organization and its employees, its customers, its stakeholders have access to, that it is safe, that it's accessible, that it's recoverable, and that you can really do more with it and always have access to it. So I know that that's a bit broad, but backup plays into that, replication plays into that, being able to actually restore it and restore it quickly, have the ability to take that and do more with it. So again, to just quick summarize data protection, it's understanding the full scope of all the data that you have access to. And sometimes it's not even the data within, say, your four walls, within your data center, within your cloud instances that you have, but also, say, the data streams that are coming from other places as well. This might be from IoT devices. This might be from third-party sources. What happens if that's compromised? How does that impact your business? How do you protect data throughout the data lifecycle, throughout the data processes that are taking place? So again, it's broad and really encompasses a lot more than traditionally what we had thought about.
So I have a question. When I used to implement backup systems, it was things were a little bit slower than they are these days in terms of, if a business went down, you wouldn't be talking microseconds before you'd be losing millions of dollars. But what is the difference between data protection and, say, business continuity? Like, why do we back up versus replicate? Are they both considered data protection? And how do you see those, and how do you talk about that?
So they all go into the idea of data protection. Again, when we just look at the two words, it's protecting your data. And there's multiple different ways of doing that. There's different purposes of where you might do business continuity versus data protection. So when we think about business continuity, that's more about keeping the business running. And that's definitely an aspect of it. But I do think we need to broaden just the idea of the protection part of that, because yes, you can replicate your data as part of your business continuity plan, but what happens if that's bad data? What happens if that's corrupted data, data that was impacted by ransomware? And well, now you just brought that over to your secondary site, and when you want to recover that or fail over to that, now that data is also bad data. And we've seen a lot of that happen, across a number of different types of customers, different types of industries and organizations that are out there. So when we think about business continuity, that is ensuring that not just the data is elsewhere, but also the systems to run and make use of that data, where traditionally data protection was more of that backup data so you can restore from it. But that's where it's really gotten more broad in scope, is to ensure that the data that's being replicated for the fail safe so you can start to run somewhere else, that it is the right data. It's not corrupted data. And that's where we start to look at really this multi-pronged approach to how do you ensure your data is protected, it's good, you can fail over, make use of it. And that's where we go beyond just backup. That's where we look at things like snapshots. That's where we look at the ability to pull data from multiple different sources, sometimes manipulate it as part of those workflows and those processes, but always ensuring it is good data and that you can recover it quickly, multi-purpose it, used for different things. But again, it's protecting not just the data itself, but the integrity of the data as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, Troy. In the context of that, as we think about it, I think one of the core elements, regardless of the architecture that you're protecting your data in, is the ability to test that recovery and being able to test it in multiple scenarios. And it sounds so simple, but as we've looked at some of the more recent ransomware attacks, as we've looked at some of the really large scale failures, there is a common denominator that a lot of these organizations just didn't have either the process in place to do the testing or the tools in place to conduct regular testing. As you talk with users, what kind of a priority are you seeing on the testing in those environments to make sure that you truly are resilient and you're protecting your data?
And that's a great question. And I think when we look at it, there's a number of different approaches. And I think one of the big challenges organizations face is, I have so much data now. How can I actually test it? How can I make sure it's great? What do I need to do to actually make sure it's viable? And they get overwhelmed because there is just so much. And unfortunately, I've spoken with a number of organizations that they don't back up their data. They just say it's just too much. There is no way we could actually do that. And the unfortunate part about that is, the reason they come to that conclusion is they're looking at a lot of the traditional ways of doing it, streaming it off somewhere else, where there's a number of things you can do to actually give you, multiple restore points. So again, if your data gets corrupted, you are impacted by ransomware, you've got a quick fail-safe to go back to the previous point in time. Maybe you do have a little bit of data loss, but it's much better having a small bit of data loss versus everything being unrecoverable. So when we look at it from that scope, that, let's not just look at it from putting it off to a streaming endpoint that is maybe a traditional backup, but we do smaller checks in between. That makes it much easier because now we can actually look at those smaller checkpoints and say, hey, can we recover this? Can we actually see it, do something with it? And when we start to look at it that way, it becomes more feasible. It actually becomes something that you can do regardless if we're talking about gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes, or exabytes. That you now have the ability to go back to a previous point in time, ensure it actually works. And if we're doing that, we're also realizing, hey, you know what? We can also, again, I bring up a lot of times the ability to multi-purpose, because that's the other thing that often becomes a challenge for organizations. The protection of their data seems to be like an insurance policy, and how much are they willing to pay to just have their data protected? And does that outweigh the potential cost of it going away? And I think we're seeing more and more that the value of that data is very substantial. Organizations are more open to spending a little bit more with that. But now if we can actually take that protection, the idea of protecting that data, but not just so it's sitting there, ready and waiting to have the coach put them into the game. But if we're actually saying, okay, great, while you're sitting on the sidelines, ensuring that if something bad happens, you're able to come in and save the day. That's great. That's necessary. But we don't want to put a huge price tag on that. Well, now if we can actually multi-purpose that, we start to gain value from it. So the cost barrier significantly goes down because, yes, we're doing everything with our production data, using our production systems, and then those additional copies of it as our fail-safe mechanism are adding value to the organization, giving that data an additional life, whether it's using AI or machine learning or, analytics, there's other things you can do even for dev test environments as well. So now we've actually reduced the cost barrier, given it, a much better lifespan, multiple purposes with it. And it's easier to actually take in and say, you know what, this makes sense. Let's ensure that not just our production systems are protected so we can one, validate that it works. Because if you are using it for multiple purposes, you're going to detect sooner rather than later that something isn't right. And obviously, there's other technologies to go in there to automate a lot of that. But I think that's a big thing that we're starting to see more of, is when people think beyond just backup, that they can do these, incremental checkpoints, do more with that. They're catching things sooner and quicker. So, not months are going by that something has been corrupted and they just haven't, found that out yet. When they multi-purpose that, they realize it very quickly, they react to it, and they don't, become headline news.
So I want to dive into that, because you've touched on a lot of things that I think are, the epitome of an overall infrastructure or data center modernization, right? Which is the fact that we are now starting to do AI. We have huge data sets. We have streaming data sets. And then you talked about kind of multi-purposing that so that you can maybe start to use that protected data and then make copies of it. What else are you seeing in terms of data protection in a newer data center? So one where they're starting to use maybe cloud technologies and they're trying to look at, okay, the data set there and protecting all of that as well and using it for other workloads.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've seen large shifts in how organizations use IT resources. And we see things like infrastructure as code. We see public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud. We see this challenge as organizations look to maintain the, I don't want to necessarily call it legacy systems, but those systems they've had in place that actually built their business, as they look to maybe retool, refactor, and go into something that's more adaptable and quick to use. And that's where we see things around Kubernetes, containers, microservices, serverless even. And all of these have data aspects. Now, when we also look at data center modernization, one of the first things that really came out of that was taking physical servers, turning that into files. So now it's data, and spreading that across all over the place. We look at containers, and that takes it down to an even smaller granular level, which now is applications that are just files and code, which they've always been, but now they've got mobility tied to it. They're tied in a little bit more. So when we look at this, it's not just the underlying data. It's not the, here's the file sets that we're using, here's a database, but now we're encapsulating the entire virtual server that is actually running that. We're looking at the actual full application, and we're seeing the ability to do a number of different things. So you can make a change to an application that's a container or microservice and rapidly make revisions to just small components of that, and that changes very quickly so you can see what's happening. Well, if something goes bad with that, you can corrupt data very, very quickly as well. But you also now see the ability to take and create new workflows. So here's your data maybe coming from a legacy, database, mainframe, SAP type system, and you're taking this data that is running your business, and now you're presenting it out to an AI workflow. And you've got data scientists that are going through doing rapid, testing of different algorithms against that data, coming up with new different models as it's going through the machine learning process. And if you can actually look at that around, okay, what can I do with that data? How does it play into my modernization efforts? And what is the end game that I'm looking for? Do I want to take all the data that I've always had, do more with it? Do I want to keep it on-prem? Do I want to make it more hybrid? Am I looking to go more distributed, whether that is saying taking into account what we can do in public cloud, or do I want to now have these open streams between remote facilities, things like retail locations or remote offices or remote manufacturing plants that's creating all this really rich data that we can do more, make more insights from. How do we protect all of that data, especially now as we get to all these various endpoints? And that kind of gets us back to this idea of, our point of record data. What is the good source? How do we know that the data is good, especially when it's so distributed? And how do I ensure that when it's at the edge, I don't have to, and that was one of the big challenges, especially with traditional backup, is having to have all this infrastructure and capabilities at these remote locations. And how do I manage that? How do I maintain that? And that's where we start to see capabilities around, say, caching come in, where now you can just have, they're using their modifying data at the edge. Maybe they're creating it, but as it comes in, that automatically gets sent into a centralized repository. So now we've got a single protection plane that we're looking at. This is our point of record data. We know this is good. We're going to protect that. And at the outskirts, if something happens that's negative, that's okay. We can blow it away. We can just rebuild it from that point of record data that's centralized.
Yep. You kind of touched on it there, but let's just take just 1 minute and talk about, because you're talking about, extending and leveraging and getting more value out of your data. There's a consequence. There's a price to that as far as how you're managing and orchestrating your data protection strategy. But that also opens up challenges, and you kind of hit the tip of the iceberg there. Let's just take 1 minute and talk about what the challenges that creates, and things that from a user or organization perspective you need to be mindful of those challenges. And again, we're working really close to the top of our time here, so let's be sharp on what some of those key critical areas that we need to be mindful of for those challenges.
Yeah. So when we look at the challenges, again, data is all over the place. The value of it has gone up significantly, not just for the organization, what they can do with it, but for people to actually get access to that. And so often when, we see a lot of organizations wanting to move to cloud, they make assumptions that, hey, just because it's in cloud, it's protected, that is my, continuity plan, because if something goes awry, my data will still be there. Well, that's not necessarily the case. So you need to ensure that it's kept at the forethought of memory and planning, that what you were doing on-prem is going to be maintained as you go to different outlets, whether that's edge instances or cloud, or you go hybrid. That a lot of those challenges is ensuring that once you understand what the data is that you have, so that's where data governance comes in as well. So what data do you have? What data is potentially exposed just because it lives somewhere, whether it's your four walls, whether it's in the cloud? Is there an exposure point? So you need to understand that. You need to understand also the data that you have available and what can you do with that? And also who would be interested in that? So you're ensuring that you are protecting the right data, at the right cost, because not all the data has the same value. So are you protecting it all with the same mechanism, which is going to be the most expensive way of doing it? Or are you kind of also tiering the way you protect your data, but you're ensuring also that it is protected? So again, make sure that the data is available, yet protected. You're reducing those exposure points that are out there while still getting the data in the right hands of the right systems, tools, people, etc., to get the most value. And never make those assumptions that just because what you did on-prem, it applies to your remote instances, that it applies in cloud as well.
Oh gosh, Troy, thank you. But I just think there's so much there. So if you could just say one thing to our customers, our partners, our everybody out there, what would you tell them about data protection? What's one thing you wish everybody knew about data protection?
Never make assumptions that your data is safe. Never make assumptions that your data will always be available. And again, it doesn't matter where it lives. I mean, that's the big thing you need to always keep in mind is as you modernize, as you change what you're doing, your data protection has to go along with that. And you can't think in the mindset of how you did it in the past. You need to evaluate it for what it is today, and not just the applications, not just the raw data, not just the files, but also as more parts of your infrastructure become data, again, VMs, containers, microservices, etc. All of that also needs to be protected, because to lose all of that means it can shut down complete operations for a business. So again, never make assumptions. Make it a forethought part of your planning and process of not only how am I going to go to this new technology, how am I going to use these new capabilities, but how am I going to protect all of that along with the data that one, it's using, and two, that it's creating. And again, understand all the risk and exposure points.
That's fantastic, Troy. This has been so great. How can people reach out to you? We see your Twitter handle down below. I would assume that that's the best way that folks that are watching this, if they got additional questions for you, that they can reach out to you.
Yes. So @StorageJockey is my Twitter handle. Also LinkedIn. It's just on LinkedIn is Troy Wilson. So it's linkedin.com/in/Troy Wilson. Luckily, I was the first Troy Wilson to join, so it made it easy.
You got lucky there. Well, thank you so much, Troy. Really appreciate it. And Phoebe, this is a great way to start off this series. It really lays the context. And we didn't really get into a lot of here's what NetApp does, and navigating the structure of that. But throughout this series, we are going to be talking very specific about strategies, techniques, and best practices, whether they're with our hyperscalers or with some of our ecosystem partners. And I'm really looking forward to this. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I think what Troy really illuminated for me is the fact that this is a big subject. And so, doing this as a series means that we can really cover, what's going on in those different areas like ransomware. And obviously, we talked about edge and IoT and being able to re-leverage your backups for something else. I think there's some really exciting topics coming up. I'm looking forward to it.
I am too. And folks, if you want more information, just click that link right down below, right there. And you'll find more information and supporting. And obviously you can reach out to myself and Phoebe. We've also got our Twitter handles here. Love to hear your feedback and any challenging questions that you might have. But I think that does it for our very first episode in this data protection series. Thank you again, Phoebe. And thank you to our audience for taking the time to watch. Thank you.
See you next time.